This is a special podcast looking ahead to GWEC's APAC Wind Energy Summit held this year in Melbourne, Australia from the 16th to the 18th of September. Get your tickets at apacsummit2025.com.au.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to an Offshore Wind Takeover. This is a bit of a rebranding of the Offshore Wind podcast. Actually, it's a special edition where we are introducing a series of speakers that are for their upcoming APAC Wind Energy Summit we're hosting in Melbourne, Victoria from the 16th to the 18th of September. And today we have a very special guest, Naomi Campbell, who is the offshore wind lead for the Philippines at the World Bank. Naomi, first of all, thanks for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Stewart. It's lovely to see you again, and thank you for having me on the podcast. Yeah,
my pleasure. So first of all, can you explain a little bit about your background? I mean, you've been a wind industry stalwart I think you've been in the wind industry longer than I have, and I've been there almost 20 years, maybe not.
Oh, yeah. I've got good moisturizer. So yes, I've been working in renewables for over 25 years. Yeah. And the last 16 in offshore wind specifically, but sort of began on land. I was with a consultant that won a turnkey sort of project management role, which I had with Scottish Power, who are part of the Iberdrola group up in Scotland. And from there, I got into the water, as I say, about 16 years ago, working with SSE on the east coast of Scotland. I also dabbled a little bit with the Crown Estate, where I worked for about 3 years as part of their offshore wind team, and as a development manager there, working on several different projects. The Moray was one of my focus areas, as was Sea Green, which was the project that I actually worked on with SSE. But then also Navix's Bay, which was one that never made it, unfortunately. And then the floater, Highwind Scotland, which was wonderful because it was the first of its type at the time. And then after that, I had my own company in the UK for a few years, and I had the privilege of going offshore, where I was working with, again, Scottish and Southern Electric, SSE, on their Beatrice projects, where I was going through construction. And that was a really fantastic experience, a wonderful team of people I'm still in touch with, even though I've made my way to Australia, where I came across with Copenhagen Offshore Partners, who are the service arm sort of Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, as they had their flagship project, Star of the South, in Australia. First offshore wind farm in Australia for quite some time, but it certainly isn't now. But I was there as the development director for around about 3 years. And then after that, set up another company. I can't help myself. I obviously have an entrepreneurial spirit. But with two other partners, Adam Thibault and Jonas Jacobsen. And then, lucky for me, the World Bank came knocking about a year ago, because they were looking for an offshore wind advisor who could work with their global offshore wind development program in the Philippines. And that's really what I've been doing for the last sort of year. And it's slowly ramped up. And I'm now in a position where I'm fortunate enough to be embedded in the Department of Energy, along with one of my fellow colleagues, Mark Leyburn. And we're roughly there on a monthly basis, working with the department directly and helping them with their upcoming auction, which is the GEA, Green Energy Auction 5, which is a dedicated offshore wind auction that the Philippines is going to run, and it's the first of its type in the Philippines. And as I say, we're there to support and assist the department as they work through the process, run the auction, and hopefully take them all the way out the other end, where we hopefully will have a few offshore wind farms that are successful.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, just listening to that, your career's pretty much mirrored the development of offshore wind globally. I mean, you start based in the North Sea and around the UK, and then you move into other markets and get into some I guess some of those expansion markets, and now looking even further ahead to those sort of like next generation markets as well. Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating journey. What piqued your interest in offshore wind to start with? Like, do you live by the coast and just think, yeah, that'd be a good place for a turbine, or what got you into the business to start with?
Oh, I'm a Londoner through and through, so
Okay,
the Thames is about as close as I got. Although I think the first one
there's
was
an issue
about
there.
Londoner, eh? But no, actually, it was through my time when I was a young sort of child, 5 years old. My father was working for the telecommunications company Marconi, and he was a contractor, and he went all over the world. And for some reason, this particular placement that he had was in Oman, on an island called Mazira. And he was working there, and they allowed him to bring his family. So I spent around, I think, year, 2 years, living my entire time on the beach, in the Indian Ocean, picking up sea turtles in buckets every morning. It's quite a free spirit. I used to go down
Wow.
early and with my red bucket, and I didn't like the seagulls eating the baby turtles. So they would hatch and they'd all try and make their way down to the sea. And I'd go down with my bucket and to pick them all up and put them in the sea so so that the seagulls wouldn't eat them.
Wow.
So hopefully there was a population spike around about 1982 through my endeavours. I'll never know,
Wow.
but maybe.
Actually, it's funny you should say that. I was just in Malaysia recently on an island, on Redang Island, and I saw a whole lot of sea turtles being released, and they said that once they release them, they come back in around about 40 years afterwards. So maybe
Oh,
maybe if you went back to the island now, that all of these sea turtles that you released back in the day would be coming back to
now's the
nest.
time.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
47, so they'd be coming back now.
yeah, right, exactly. Anyway, look, thanks very much for having us, for being part of the show, and being also for agreeing to speak as part of the APAC summit in Melbourne. You're going to be on a couple of panels. The first one is relating to the permitting around onshore wind. From your experience, and what does streamlined permitting look like in today's wind markets?
Yeah, well, look, I think I've probably been asked this question every year for the last 25.
Oh, I'm sorry for the lack of imagination.
Because it's been a question that's always been there, right? And what my experience really shows me is that it looks different depending on where you are on the globe. Australia, for example, is a federalised country. So I'm based in Melbourne now, and a federalised country. So there's different laws that, depending on what state you're developing in, as well as the federal level. Whilst in the Philippines, there was a recent report by the Carbon Trust. It's for offshore, but I could imagine there's a similar sort of position for onshore there. It basically identified around 80 permits that a single project requires to develop and connect. So, it's very different depending on where you are. And in general, I would say that one thing that I've seen that I think is probably universal is having at least sort of one government entity that coordinates. They may not be the only regulator, but at least a single point of contact that is the coordination for permitting is a good thing in my experience. But it's really only a good thing as long as it's well resourced. Because if it's not, it can become a bottleneck. I think really prudently for where we are, especially now, both in the Philippines and in Australia, is permitting. Is a process that sits under often the regulation that's linked to legislation. And when you look at the legislation itself, it needs to reflect the nature of the energy transition. And a lot of permitting and environmental legislation has been developed decades ago. Even though you might have new clean energy legislation, so renewable energy targets or emission reduction targets that are relatively new, they often just point to the existing legislation and the existing permitting pathways. And it's sadly the case that the process, because it's so old, it doesn't necessarily protect the environment from the impacts that are now being generated by these new technologies. And nor does it actually facilitate social license, because the bar that was set in 1980 is very different to the bar that you have to, reach now as we stand today. And I think that what it does, unfortunately, in that situation, it slows down credible development, which is in the best interest of the particular nation. And what I'm really looking forward to when I come to the APAC summit and I'm involved with this panel is hearing from the panelists and what they have to say on the matter, especially in the Australian context, where only yesterday the Federal Environment Minister committed to bringing forward legislative reform, so the reform of the Environmental Protection Act here, and streamlining it specifically for renewables projects.
Yeah, look, I mean, that's fantastic when you hear countries that are actually dealing with the problem head on and dealing with the challenges and actually acknowledging the fact that for some reason, the permitting process has got really, really complex. And it seems that the more mature the industry has gotten, the more complex the permitting around it has become. I'm not sure if we're becoming victims of our own success, that people are like, wow, that was pretty, in the early days, it was pretty easy to put up a wind turbine, more or less. You engage with a very local community, but now it seems to be, as you say, well, all three levels of government in an Australian context seems to have a bit of that needs to get council permission, state permission, and then also federal permission in some cases as well. So it seems like it's a really big challenge. I'd be interested to also have the panel explore some of those issues around other markets in the APAC region where you see, like I've heard examples, for example, in markets like India, where it's not permitting for the turbine or the farm itself, but it's like the grid permitting. It's like the other infrastructure that supports that. And if those kind of two things fall out of sync, then you've got like inventory coming to site that you can't erect, etc. And I mean, and there's nothing that kills the economics of a project more than delays, I guess.
Yeah, and I always remember, actually, this was something that struck me when I was working on Beatrice and in the development stage, and it was the same onshore as well. There's very few things at that point in construction that can stop your project. But as we've seen very recently, the permits and the approvals, if you're unsafe or if you're breaking one of your conditions, not only does it sort of potentially stop your projects, that's probably the least of your worries, but you can also end up, being prosecuted, and if you're a company director, ending up in jail. So it's really, the consequences of it when it is triggered in that phase of development is really significant and can be really significant. So, yeah, I think, as you say, it's if that's happening in India, it must be really hard to plan your project if you know that it's your permits aren't aligning, or you're having to deal with so many different parties that you're how you triangulate everybody and work with everyone is a real minefield.
But I mean, and I also think, like, even in the Australian context, in the onshore, I remember when I was over there in June, there was a talk around one of the Queensland projects that they had to hand back their permit after, like, the government there was a 90-day cooling period or something after being awarded the award at the start. And then just before that 90 days was up, the government actually called in the permit because they were worried about the lack of consultation with the local community. So I guess that kind of it sends a clear message about the importance of engagement in local community and getting the local stakeholders on side and making sure you've done your due diligence. I mean, from a developer's perspective, is that something that you're extra aware about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in Australia, there's a rating scheme. I don't know if you know about this, Stuart, but they're bringing in a rating scheme for renewable developers, and it's going to be run by a credit rating agency, where you're having to. At the moment, I think it's voluntary, but ultimately, it's something that I think they're hoping will be useful for the communities, so that they can, get a gauge of who they are dealing with. But obviously, it's going to be very much about, well, you're new to the market, you've been in the market a long time. It will favour developers, I think, who've been here for a while. And it will, hopefully help pull up the socks and make sure you're doing, you're following due process, and you're doing what you need to do to make sure that community are aware of your plans, are brought into the process, and have a say in what you're doing. And really coming right back to the start of our conversation, what you were saying about community, they're so important to how they shape a project, even a large project. It may be if you're offshore, you're kilometers away, but ultimately you're bringing your cables to the shore, and it's the communities at the shore that are going to experience changes because of the fact that something new is coming into the environment. So yeah, I think even if you're onshore, offshore, being really conscious of dealing with community and making sure that's a priority from day one, and that's even finding your site. I mean, there's a piece of legislation called Nature Positive, which is a bit controversial in different jurisdictions. They're applying it in different ways, and some companies are taking it upon themselves already to apply it. But effectively, it's about making sure that you're bringing net benefit to the environment. But in those sort of scenarios, really where you site your project is very, very important. And it comes down to finding these sites where you can, if you like, develop in a very sustainable and a way that is aligned with the environment and with the community, and avoid those areas where it isn't appropriate. And I think in the World Bank, there's something that we've really worked on with our roadmaps, is to try very early on to identify the potential, but in a way that we're applying, sort of a filtering system so that we are identifying the most credible areas for development, but also bringing in the process of marine spatial planning and ESMAP, which is another sort of marine spatial planning approach that the World Bank has developed. Where we can also support the countries where they are still planning their offshore wind markets, or to make sure they plan them in a way that they are avoiding those issues further down the line. So yeah, it's really important, really, really important.
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. And it's about helping markets reach their full potential and to make sure that we don't get beaten by what we know. I think that we've been developing offshore wind around the world for at least 30 years now. And I think we've learned a lot of lessons along the way. And I mean, I know that the World Bank, you released the key factors report, and then also updated that earlier this year, I believe it was, that we had some, I think maybe Sean even joined the podcast earlier this year to talk about the updated key factors report. But it's pretty important, the work that you guys have done. Can you maybe explain a little bit to the listeners about how that is impacting your work in the Philippines, and how you're helping the Philippines to reach their full potential?
We have effectively delivered roadmaps which then sort of go into a lot more detail. They're focused at government, and they basically provide, if you like, a kind of step-by-step guide to how to develop the necessary framework to enable offshore wind. And that sort of starts with looking at embedding it into national strategy. What's the need for offshore wind, making sure that you have a need, because even though you have a potential in terms of you might have strong wind, it might not necessarily be that you've got a need. So making sure that it's part of your need and that you've got a strong basis for looking at it as a technology, and then working through the necessary steps to develop legislation, regulation, policy, and then guidelines, etc., so that you can.
Sorry. Just on the need part, for the Philippines, specifically around the Philippines, how did you establish the need, or how did the Filipino government establish the need for offshore wind? I mean, what was either missing from their energy mix, or why was offshore wind seen as a vital component specifically for the Philippines?
Yeah, the Philippines is so interesting because it is, it's 90% of its potential is floating. So that already sort of puts it into a different category. But the Philippine government are at a very crucial point in their development. So the Philippines has got a very high growth projection. So it's not the highest in Southeast Asia, but it's still very high. And Southeast Asia is a bit of a booming place. Economically, you have these semiconductors, you have sort of the development of data centers, new industry, but you also have that combined with growing population that isn't electrified. I mean, the Philippines is a so low-income country. There's still a lot of people who live in energy poverty. And also they suffer from the fact that they don't have one really strong natural resource in terms of an energy resource that they can just really easily plug into. It's still, it's very mountainous, it's forested, it's tropical. They have earthquakes, they have typhoons. There's a lot of things in the Philippines that make it challenging just to kind of have centralized energy, and they've been importing energy in the form of coal and gas for quite a long time and paying the price for it. So for them, they're looking at all different technologies. It's really interesting when you go there, the different types of technology suppliers are in the market and what they're trying to enable. So it's not just onshore, it's offshore. And especially with the president who's in place at the moment, President DeMarcos, he made it part of his sort of wish that he would have offshore wind within his term, which runs to 2028. So you've got a really strong political will, and that stems from, I think, understanding the potential they have, wanting that electrification, needing those green electrons, and really seeing the Philippines as being at a point where its development trajectory is advancing and it could be accelerating really rapidly. Youthful population, it's got all the sort of hallmarks of something that could be really big and a really, really important player in Asia, and start punching above its weight if it moves quickly. So offshore wind was something that was at the highest level supported, and that's really made a massive difference, because what that's done is like a triangle. It then provides the impetus to the bureaucrats and that level, so that then part of their Renewable Energy Act they've used and they've signed off and they've said, right, this is what we want, and offshore wind is part of that. And then they've instigated the development of their first green energy auction for offshore wind, which I mentioned at the start, and it's dedicated. And then they've basically said, well, what can we achieve by 2028 to align with the political will? And so they've narrowed their technology to fixed, bearing in mind that they need to get to floating, but fixed is where they've set their stall out, and this is about proof of concept. And then they set a target of 3.3 gigawatts, which allows competition. So I think for them, they're really seeing it as a crucial part of their energy mix. And the trajectory is such that they need to also be at the forefront of floating. And that's something that we in the World Bank are asking ourselves, how can we help them with that? And my role here with the Philippine government is sort of one that's under a cooperation agreement that's between the Department of Energy and the IFC. And myself and Mark, as I mentioned, are embedded into the department, and we provide just in time, we call it support, so they can come and knock on the door. Naomi, I've got a question, and I go, oh, all right, too hard for me. I better call the team. And in the Global Offshore Wind Program, we've got 17 amazing individuals with decades of offshore wind experience, spanning all sorts of, sort of skill set, whether that's financing, engineering, resource management, comms, sort of a whole range of things. So it's really meant that I could tap into what we have in the program, and then we turn around as quickly as possible a response to them so that they can get some advice from us and from our knowledge base to help inform them in their decisions. So that's what we've been doing, and that's how we've been focused. But also we are working with the Energy Regulatory Commission, who are in parallel developing what they call the gear price, so the green energy auction price for offshore wind, which will set the ceiling for the offshore wind bidding price. And we've been working with them and UK Pact, who are sort of a part of the UK sort of outreach donor government stuff, and we're helping them and their consultants to come together to collaborate as two kind of entities working together to help the Energy Regulatory Commission come up with a price that's realistic and appropriate for its first offshore wind auction.
You mentioned about the Philippines having predominantly, I think you said 90% was going to be floating offshore wind potential, for the floating offshore wind potential. And I also recall that you said that you were part of the High Wind project, which was back in the early 2010s or so, maybe even before then. It's fair to say that the industry probably would have expected to see the floating offshore wind sector take off. That hockey stick would have been, started to, move from some of these demo projects, pre like scale projects, into something a bit more commercial and utility scale projects that, on a more consistent basis across more markets now, and also bringing the supply chain with that and maturing the supply chain with that. Could you perhaps give a bit of reflections on how you see the development of the floating offshore wind market over time, and what is needed to perhaps make sure that the floating offshore market actually materialises now?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Stuart. I'm sure it's one that anyone in that area of the sector is asking themselves, like, how do we keep the momentum going while we're in this period of, say, slowdown, but waiting for really those big projects to get to the point that they are de-risking and ultimately commercializing utility scale floating. I think from where I sit and what we're doing in the World Bank at the moment in Asia Pacific is we're saying to ourselves, well, is the solution going to be one that is European based? Is it that they need the European market to mature enough so that it then can roll out into Asia? And I think from a developer's perspective, there's no doubt that being a developer and having had that experience, if you're sitting in one of the big development companies where they've developed floating, it's really important because there's issues that are very specific to floating that aren't, as prevalent or even there when you're looking at fixed bottom projects. So having that experience as a European developer or a company coming out of Europe, it's really important, and having that learning transfer and knowledge transfer is crucial, especially even in Asia. But then you look at supply chain and you look at where floating might actually sort of, I guess the technology itself might be generated from. And you've got China sitting right there on the doorstep. It's controversial, but at the same time, it can't be ignored. It's the biggest offshore wind market in the world. And although they haven't quite got to the floating point yet, they're looking at it definitely. And I would have thought that that's something that they will start to progress as their fixed bottom sites get lesser and lesser. So I think you will soon see the regionalization part, and how can you get the benefits of Europe but have the regionalization in APAC? That's a real question that we're kind of starting to grapple with a bit in the World Bank, and we're trying to draw in not just the knowledge bank of the wind program, but also looking at other development banks, so the ADB, for example, and other donors. So donors such as Denmark, UK, Japan is an ESMAP donor. So bringing those parties together, as well as the carbon trusts, GWEC, the Offshore Energy Pathway, not-for-profits, to come together and say, well, what actually, if we're all, we all know this is something that needs to be tackled, how can we support governments like the Philippines to keep the momentum going so that there isn't this big lag potentially, maybe it won't be that big, but, a lag where they haven't got development. What can we do together? And that's a question we've just started asking ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, we see it all the time, and I think that, yeah, if we look at the supply chain and we look at what's happening around some of those companies, there's been a lot of supply chain companies that have funneled a lot of money into into the development of floating offshore wind foundations, and you would have, I guess, for those investors, they probably would have hoped to have a quicker return on investment and start to see some of those things unlocked. And I mean, yeah, I heard recently that Australia was either considering or that maybe looking at having some sort of like technology-specific auctions to make it easier for floating offshore wind to take hold. And so, like you actually acknowledge the fact that floating isn't as cost efficient as the fixed bottom at the moment, but with the scale of floating offshore wind, it has huge potential to drive cost out if we can get economies of scale and get a lot of those markets built out. There is a huge potential to really start to drive out the costs and make it cost competitive. We saw it with fixed bottom offshore wind. I remember back in the day, when offshore wind first started, everyone's like, it'll never compete with onshore wind. And, even back in the day when you were talking about those early projects, you look at the first CFD prices or the ROCs or whatever they were then that they had going around in the UK at that stage. And offshore wind was looked to be very cost prohibitive, but now, 10 years later and some investment, and it's probably one of the cheaper forms of new build energy on that scale that you're seeing in the world. So, I mean, I think it just is a matter of finding the right levels of support and getting governments to actually lean into that.
Yeah, and I think also, Stuart, it's finding those areas where floating wind makes sense. Not to pun, making offshore wind work is the World Bank's, next stage of the key factors report. But,
sure.
Where does it make sense? I think is that, coming back to that question, because I think, when you're floating, the key challenge obviously is that sometimes you're, many kilometers offshore. And in those scenarios, you're adding cost in because of the nature of the fact that you're so far away. Whereas there are opportunities, especially in like the Philippines, where actually the continental shelf is such that you're not kilometers, many kilometers away. You're actually within striking distance. And if you can find the sites where you maybe already have some transmission, maybe there isn't, there's a port that's not too far away, the things that actually make a difference, especially when you've got greenfield, it's all greenfield, it's finding those projects that are going to be the most credible, the ones that are going to deliver. And I think that's what we're kind of asking ourselves is, okay, if you've got this market, where will floating take off? Where will it be, feasible? And where can it be delivered? And what can we do right now to start de-risking that for when it's ready? When the private sector comes back and those developers are ready to start putting their DevEx in, what can we do now as a collective to de-risk that so that it's ready?
Yeah, look, I'm sure that I could talk to you for hours about this, but and look, thank you very much for giving our listeners a sneak peek into some of the topics that we're going to be looking at the APAC summit. I'm very much looking forward to seeing you in Melbourne again from the 16th to the 18th of September this year. So, Naomi, thanks for joining the Offshore Wind podcast takeover, and I'd like to get you extended an invitation to have you back on the show when Rebecca and I take up the reins again after the APAC summit to perhaps talk about and unpack specifically what's going on in the Philippines, because it's such an interesting market, and we'd really like to give our listeners some insight into what that looks like. Yeah. So I hope you'll join us again for another episode of the Offshore Wind podcast further down the track.
Thank you, Stuart, and sincere thanks to the GWEC team as well, who we've worked with when it comes to organising study tours. So we've got our study tour where we've got delegates from the Philippines, from Vietnam, from Colombia coming to Melbourne, and it's GWEC that are helping us with the logistics and really supporting us to be able to deliver, successful study tours. We have done the last, sort of 2 APAC summits, and we're really looking forward to being in Melbourne. I'm here already, but we've got another 7 people from the World Bank Offshore Wind Programme coming and working and being with not just the delegates, but GWEC and other, donors, other parties from all over the region to basically come together and to look at it from a regional perspective and say, right, what can we do together? I think that's such an important thing that this summit specifically offers us the opportunity to do. So thank you very much, and I would love to come on, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you and Rebecca in Melbourne in a couple of weeks' time.
Thanks very much, Naomi. So there you have it, listeners. If you would like to hear more from Naomi and the opinions about onshore wind permitting and particularly offshore wind in the Philippines, and also to get to mingle with some of the World Bank delegations and members of the World Bank ESMAP team that are coming down and accompanying the delegations, please make sure you get along to Melbourne at the Jeff's Shed or the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre from the 16th to the 18th of September. Tickets are available now, and we look forward to seeing you there. So thank you very much, and we'll catch you next time.
Okay.
Thanks for listening. If you like what you've heard, there's more of that and many more discussions to be had at the APAC Wind Energy Summit on the 16th to the 18th of September at the Melbourne Exhibition and Convention Centre. GWEC will be there with a host of thought leaders from around the industry, having discussions around onshore wind, offshore wind, O&M, and much, much more. Make sure you pick up your tickets today, and we look forward to seeing you there.